10 p.m.
13 minutes past 9. In just a moment, we'll be talking to you about the case of what's been described as patronizing diplomacy. Here we're talking about U.S. President Donald Trump meeting with 5 West African leaders. What are the hallmarks of that and what is behind that? Is it a trend when the U.S. deals with Africa, particularly given the fact that it's seen as donor number one when it comes to aid funding? All that and more coming up. But for now, we talk about what's been called the deadliest attack this year in Mali. More than 40 soldiers being killed in a major assault on a military base early in June, with terrorist groups growing bolder and spreading across the Sahel. Military forces in the region are struggling to respond. Joining us now to speak about what's happened is Dr. Olayinka Ajala, Associate Professor of Politics and International Relations at Leeds Beckett University. He recently explored these developments in an article for The Conversation titled "Why Attacks on Military Camps in the Sahel Are Increasing." A very good evening, Dr. Olayinka Ajala. Thank you so much for speaking to us. So how would you answer that question in a nutshell?
As I said in that article, which you mentioned right now, in the last couple of years, we've seen an increase in attacks, not just random attacks on individuals and communities, but also attacks on military bases across West Africa and the Sahel, especially in Burkina Faso and Mali. There was also one that was experienced in Togo last year. So there's been an increase in attacks on military bases. And I believe there are a couple of issues. The first one, I think, is because of the loss of surveillance. Due to the military takeover in some of these countries last year, especially in Niger, the largest drone base in Niger Republic, which was in Agadez, operated by the United States, is no longer in operation. And this was a major base for surveillance and for also reconnaissance activities across the Sahel. So it's a major reason why I think these groups have been emboldened, because they believe they're no longer watched as they were when the base was in operation. The other issue I mentioned again in the article was also the issue relating to human rights abuses, which has increased the recruitment into the folds of the terrorist organization. So we've seen paramilitaries, we've seen non-government organizations being harmed, vigilantes that are involved in counterterrorism, and some of these are involved in human rights atrocities, which is then backfiring now, increasing recruitment into these groups. The other issue is also the issue of financing. We've seen that the terrorist groups are getting more ways of financing themselves. We've seen around drilling of natural resources and things like that. So they've changed their tactics in a nutshell. We've noticed that they believe attacking military bases will reduce or dampen the morale of military officers, and also put fear in the hearts of people to believe that they cannot be protected by these military officers and organizations.
So let's look back at first, as you mentioned, the presence of particularly foreign military troops. And I'm looking at the Americans, the French, and at some point Russian militia, quote unquote, groups. And there's also what was the presence of multinational joint task force groups. What role were they playing that has now created a chasm or a vacuum?
Yeah, they played different roles in different areas. So let's start with the multinational joint task force around Lake Chad Basin, and which covers Nigeria, Cameroon, and Chad. They were able to reduce militant and terrorist activities around that region since they were formed, or they were reformed in 2015. The second one is the G5 Sahel. So the G5 Sahel was sponsored and funded by France. And this involved Mali, Burkina Faso, Mauritania, and the other two countries in the region that were involved in the fight against terrorism. So they also played a significant role in the Sahel. But the most important one is the United States. And when we talk about foreign military agents or foreign military forces, the United States operated the largest military drone base in Africa, which was in Agadez. And from this base, they were able to fly drones, which were used for surveillance. And then they harvested the information from the drones and then shared them accordingly with partners or partner countries across the region. So just the mere idea that you're being watched is a deterrence to terrorist organizations. So since the drone base ceased operation when the military junta took over in Republic of Niger, the terrorist groups have been emboldened because now those countries don't have those kind of capability or capacity to be able to survey this vast area of land across the region. And then we've also seen that foreign military troops that were training the locals or the local armies have also left. So nothing is replacing all this. So if you have a vacuum has been created, which is not been filled, and this has emboldened terrorist organizations to launch further attacks and also to attack military bases in large numbers.
You've been studying the formation of these terrorist groups, and on the one hand, you say these foreign forces themselves either helped germinate these terrorist forces, and you also spoke about human rights abuses and what you say you've seen as a trend of those who are fed up with the presence of these terrorist groups have themselves been ripe for recruiting to fight other terrorist groups.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. I've been researching the formation of insurgent groups in West Africa and the Sahel for over a decade now. And we've seen a lot of changes. We've seen some periods of gains. We've seen different tactics being used. And one of the tactics used is the use of vigilantes. So a lot of countries, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, many of these countries, because of the topography of the areas and the huge land area, there are so many ungoverned areas or what we call alternatively governed areas. So these are areas where the government do not have 100% capacity to govern and to protect. So in those areas, either the vigilantes are formed themselves and they are self-governed, and then they try to protect their own interest, because terrorism affects everybody. It doesn't just affect the central government in Bamako or in Niamey or in Abuja. It affects everybody. It affects people outside of the country's capitals and even in rural areas. So some of these countries have been able to form vigilantes, which are paramilitaries. Some of them are even actually embedded in the military for reconnaissance, for intelligence gathering, and in some instances even for direct fighting against the terrorists. But the problem is many of these people are not well trained. They are not trained. Recently, Human Rights Watch released a document or a report on human rights abuses carried out by soldiers in Burkina Faso. But when you dig deep and look at some of these things, a lot of these human rights abuses are actually carried out by the paramilitaries, by the vigilantes. So if they are embedded haphazardly, and this creates a problem, the question is, if you are going to embed military vigilantes or paramilitaries into the military, then they need to be trained on the rules of engagement, and then they need to also understand the tactics. But again, on the flip side, it's difficult because some of these people are affected personally or emotionally. Some of them have had their cattle stolen or their family members killed, so they have personal interest. So when they catch suspects or terrorist suspects, rather than handing them over to the forces or to the government, they take action. They take they commit jungle justice because of the personal effects. So all these multiple layers of issues needs to be looked into in order to fight the terrorism in the region.
So let's talk about that, because on the one hand, we have seen criticism against the Sahelian military for their ascending to power in non-democratic ways. And you say these very military agencies are unable to protect themselves against the growing terrorist groups because they are not adapting fast enough. So it goes to the heart of the issue of what the rationale is for having a military, because I understand that it is to protect sovereign nations. But it seems like while the two operations may be militaristic in nature, but what is the end goal? Because it's about fighting for power. So the ascendancy is somehow related. And I'm not sure if you understand what I'm saying, but I suppose what it goes to is the terrorism funding avenues that exist for this to be, a never-ending cycle.
I totally understand what you're trying to say. So when you look at those three countries, for instance, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, the military seized power on issues relating to security. So they cited corruption, they cited lack of development, they cited poor governance, but primarily they cited insecurity. All of them cited the same thing, and they promised to fight insecurity, especially the scourge of terrorism. But now they are also realizing that it's not as easy as they felt it would be. And fighting terrorism requires a joint action. It requires international, multidimensional actors coming together. Because the area we're talking about, these are huge areas, lands that are alternatively governed or ungoverned. And now the military juntas are realizing that, well, it's very difficult. It's not as easy. The Alliance of Sahel states, Sahelian states, for instance, they said they were going to institute, I think, a 4,000 or 5,000 strong military among themselves. But the logistics, the funding, the parameters have been difficult for them to work out in the last couple of months. So I think they need to realize and understand that, well, not only that they can not fight these organizations by themselves alone, they need to find a way to work with ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, and have a framework in place. Because now the G5 Sahel is gone. The multinational joint task force is weakened because Niger pulled out last year or early this year. So when you look at these structures that have been put in place for over a decade, that have crumbled without any organization or any structure replacing it, then we can see why the terrorist groups are having the upper hand.
I mean, a very interesting thing is playing out in the United States at the moment, where we see US President Donald Trump in DC meeting with 5 West African nations. And we spoke about the role of the United States in some of these conflicts, whether it's through peacekeeping or actually the funding of some of these terrorist groups, whether transparently or not. And one wonders then about the role of illegal mining and the proceeds thereof, because one of the things at the center of the talks with the United States is the commercial role that they can play bilaterally. And minerals, we know, are at the center of it. Is it something that we ought to worry about, given the criticism of the genuflection by some of the West African leaders when speaking to the US president?
Yeah, absolutely. The role of natural resources is very important. And when we look at what is happening now, I personally I'm afraid when I look at the trends and dimensions. When we look at oil and gas and the role oil and gas play in the stabilization of countries and communities across Africa, now the same thing is happening the second time with the green economy, the green resources. Africa has 30% of the green resources which the world needs to move to green energy. Now, terrorist groups are taking control of some of the extraction of these resources. And this is a major way of funding for themselves. Previously, the funding used to come from taxing the locals, or kidnapping, mass kidnapping and the likes. But because there are no longer a lot of expatriates in the region to kidnap anyway, or even there are not a lot of money the locals can give. So to sustain the huge resources that are needed by these terrorist organizations to begin to function, to fund themselves, to feed their fighters, and to buy weapons and logistics, they need other sources of funding. And then we've seen that the extraction of natural resources is a major one. So this is something that needs to be looked into. The question is, who are they selling these natural resources to? They don't sell them within Africa. They are selling most of them outside of Africa.
Absolutely.
So that means directly or indirectly, funding is coming from outside through illegal trafficking of natural resources and of weapons and all the likes that are funding and sustaining these groups. And this needs to be looked into.
Dr. Ajala, unfortunately, we have run out of time. We would have loved to chat more, but thank you so much for your time and sharing your thoughts. Dr. Olayinka Ajala, Associate Professor of Politics and International Relations at Leeds Beckett University. It brings the time to just about 29 minutes past 9.
When the sun goes down, we don't stop the talk.